I am joined by seasoned civil rights attorney who's been branded one of the brightest and most well-respected voices in conversations on law, civil rights, and also criminal justice. Welcome in, Charles Coleman Jr. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here, Adrienne.
So the last 24 hours has been absolutely wild in terms of the justice system, or lack thereof when it comes to justice, but operating in a very duplicitous manner, as we saw hordes of people really rushing and breaking into the Capitol with almost the escort of the Capitol Police. Yet no one seemed to be arrested. I think they just counted, under 15 arrests. There was one woman who was shot, and I believe she did die, but it was nothing like the level of force and violence that we saw go on last summer with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd's protests. So how does this resonate with you?
I think if there was ever a question about the two Americas that we talk about oftentimes with regard to the criminal justice system, this is exactly it. This is exactly indicative of what so many people in different communities have said about the fact that police operate differently when they are dealing with different people and different groups of people and different demographics in America. If you look at what the response was to protests and rioters across the country nationwide in the wake of civil unrest surrounding George Floyd, in the wake of civil unrest around Jacob Blake, and also, of course, in the wake of civil unrest around Breonna Taylor, it pales in comparison in terms of the level of force and aggression to what we saw today in terms of the Capitol Police. You mentioned the word escort. I've literally seen videos where Capitol Police just decided to move the barricades and allow protesters to go about their way and instead of being overrun. And it really does strike me as odd. And I think it's important that viewers understand this. For you and me, as people of color, we watched today folks do things that, as a black man in America, I would be murdered for. I have no doubt in my mind that had I and 29,000 of my closest friends gotten together and decided that we were going to storm the United States Capitol, damage property, put law enforcement officers' safety and lives at risk, that there would not have been a limit to the amount of force that would have been used to respond to that. And I think that that's really important that we understand, because we can't keep having this conversation about the disparity in criminal justice in America, the disparity in police culture in America and how toxic it is, and ignore things like that. The difference is appalling. It's not surprising for those of us who have been paying attention, but it's very, very real.
Absolutely, and it just seemed to be very much a brazen, blatant display of white supremacy and that unified sense of white solidarity with the police officers there who were just allowing these insurrectionists to really just storm the Capitol building without any kind of limits or restrictions whatsoever. And it's scary. And that is really what their message is that they're all trying to communicate to us, that, hey, these people who are supposed to protect and serve aren't necessarily here to do that if you look a certain way. And we really got to see that when we saw this past summer with the protests that were galvanized by anti-racism. And so what do you think it will say to people moving forward in terms of bringing out the vote, as this is now coming on the heels of the Georgia senator election and the black vote truly coming out and essentially helping take the Senate?
Well, I think that that's a very good question, and it raises sort of the inquiry around where do we go from here as a nation? Because I think in order to answer that, we have to be very clear about how we got here. This is, to me, representative of the juncture of cultural, societal, and then political sort of boiling over all together in the same cauldron at the same time. And I think that there are a number of different factors that have contributed to how we got here. And we're not gonna be able to move forward until we look at what those are and we're honest with ourselves. Culturally, we have become increasingly polarized in terms of how we have discussions, in terms of our ability to disagree without being disagreeable, in terms of our desire or willingness to see each other in our wholeness. From a societal standpoint, quite frankly, there's a lot of blame that has gone around because, for the past 4 years, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue has been a reality show of ratings gold. People have sort of kept their eyes fixated on the president, on what he has talked about, whether you agreed with him, whether you didn't agree with him. His candidacy, his presidency, from the moment that he declared all the way to today has been sort of must-see TV. And that has only fanned the flames of where we are. And then politically, of course, there have been a number of people in the GOP who have refused to stand refused to stand up and condemn what has been going on, what has been festering. And so all of these things have sort of laid a very fertile ground for what we saw today in Washington, D.C., and quite frankly, throughout the country, and what we've been seeing. And until we're able to address that, I think a lot of people are sort of going to wonder, how much of this can the Democratic process fix? How much of my vote is going to be able to change the tone and tenor of America's discourse around toxic policing, around criminal justice reform, and around these other positions and issues that actually matter? So I think a lot of it goes back to asking the question and being honest about how do we get here before we can talk about where we move on from.
Absolutely, and one of the ways that we got here was through Program 1033, where the US Department of Defense had transferred so many $1 billion, I think around $7 billion in military equipment to local police and law enforcement, essentially militarizing our police departments. And so now they have their own tanks, flamethrowers, all sorts of things that are unnecessary when it comes to really relating to a community and helping serve them. So, hey, what can we do to stop this process of police continuing to see the everyday citizens that they serve as opponents in almost a military context?
Well, I don't think that we can expect policing to make changes to itself from within. I think that if that was the case, that would have taken place a long time ago. In all of the conversations that I've had in community with different groups, with different professionals sitting at the table, my experience has been law enforcement is the one profession that refuses to really hold itself accountable. And they usually respond by saying, well, you don't understand the job of a cop. You don't understand how difficult it is to do this job. And what I often say is, how is it that we can all concede that we can improve at our profession, and yet law enforcement unfailingly is the one group of folks who refuses to give an inch when it comes to the need to perhaps engage differently or do things differently or look at things in a different way? And so to that extent, I don't expect that cultural change to come from within. I think that it's a change that has to be prompted by the people who are put in office, by the people who have platforms to continue to apply pressure on law enforcement. And the conversation that we have around toxic police culture in America is one that for me now only underscores the importance of abolishing qualified immunity. So that was something that was a conversation during election season to some extent, especially as we saw this summer of civil unrest around the different acts of police violence committed against Black bodies. But it kind of sort of went away after the results came out, primarily because many people were just excited that Trump had lost. But the reality is, going forward, if you're talking about criminal justice reform, if you're talking about making things better and detoxifying the culture of police in America, you have to have a conversation about qualified immunity and getting rid of it, because that's the one counter that you have to militarizing the police, as we saw over the past several years.
Absolutely, and something that kind of almost got overlooked just a bit, or at least we didn't get a chance to spend as much time on it, is the results of the Jacob Blake investigation, where the prosecutors essentially came forward and said, we are not going to prosecute the police officers that put multiple bullets in his back and left him paralyzed. And the thought that the rationale there in terms of, he had a knife, that it was justified. These are things we hear all the time and they are problematic. And so how would you address that at the local lower level when you have institutions that are unwilling to hold their officers accountable?
So that's a great question. I think that we have to really examine where the power players are, and every jurisdiction is going to be different. Every place is going to be different. I know that, for example, in New York, where I reside and where I practice law, the police union is a behemoth of an animal. And that's something that is extremely hard to counter and hard to deal with. I think that the way that you sort of navigate that space, if you're, Joe Citizen USA, is that you really do have to have a set of criminal justice non-negotiables for anyone who is seeking your vote. And I think that when it comes to on a local and a state level, especially as it relates to those folks who are looking for your support in positions of law enforcement, be it a state attorney general or a local prosecutor, the question that we should all be asking them as a non-negotiable, if you want the support of my vote, if you want me to advocate for other people to vote for you, if you want me to bring people to the polls, you need to be very clear with me about what it is that you intend to do to dismantle the institution of qualified immunity. And I think that that's how you approach it on a local level.
All right, absolutely. I like that approach, most definitely. Thank you so much for joining us. Charles Coleman Jr., can you tell us where they can find you on social media?
Thanks for having me. You can find me on Twitter at CF Coleman Jr. On Facebook, it's Charles F. Coleman Jr. The verified page is right there. And then on Instagram, it's CFC40_official. So you can look me up. I'm on all three.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.